This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, true seekers and true crime junkies. Welcome back to another episode of Hit the Road, Jack, Finding the Zodiac. Today, we are going to talk a little bit. I'm bringing some things back from last week. We were going to have, I'd like to actually welcome on now, Nolan Del Campo and Terry Batcher.
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so I literally started to work on the word pickup last week, I think, if you remember, Nolan. I had done some comparisons to the word pickups, and I thought it was probably in my best interest to go and look and see what I could find from Jack, because I was really just making a comparison between the crime notes themselves. So I went back and I looked up some stuff from Jack. Let's go ahead and throw the PowerPoint. I'll show you guys what I found. All right, so up here in this left, where is my mouse? Come here. All right, so up here in this left-hand corner, I have the word pick up twice, pick off twice, and the word picked up. And that runs down. The top is Jack. The next is JonBenet Ramsey, followed by the Atlanta, Georgia killer, followed by the Zodiac killer, and then followed by Jack once again. When I actually found the word pickup in Jack's writing, now, of course, the context of the word pickup is used differently between these two messages. So one is hyphenated and one is not. But when I put those together, I found that the lineup and the spacing of these were pretty darn accurate, I'd say. I mean, obviously, despite the fact that that hyphen is in there, there's quite a decent space beyond the hyphen for the word up in the JonBenet Ramsey version of pickup. But we still found that the U fell on the right-hand side of that marker. And when we did the lineup of Atlanta, Georgia and the Zodiac killer, we found that the lineup and spacing of those were also similar to one another. So now we have spacing and lineup between Jack and JonBenet Ramsey, and then the Atlanta, Georgia, and the Zodiac. When I found this other word picked up from Jack, I found that the C, can you guys see that? That C is identical in shape, in form, despite or missing the connections because the bottom picked up is in cursive. We can still see that the form and shape and slant of those particular character or letters are actually are consistent with one another. Also to the fact that the I dotting of the I actually took place over the top of the C in both cases between Jack and the Zodiac. So I thought that was a very interesting find. A lot of people will ask me how I can cross compare cursive writing with printed writing, and this is how we would do it. Obviously, this is not in cursive, but we can still see that the shape and the flow as it moves from one to the next is still similar. The slant is the same, the placement of the I dot's the same, the shape of the C is the same. So that's what I look at when I'm looking at cursive writing, if that's all I have to compare to a printed written letter. What do you guys think about that?
We don't have much of Zodiac in cursive, right? That's Jack at the moment.
Right. Zodiac was a strict print. And of course we can see that by this two-stroke P up here. So we have the stem that comes down, and then we have the bull that's made separately. That's not the easiest or fastest way to create the letter P. So that's what people do when they're attempting to disguise their handwriting, is they'll go into a strict 2 and 3 stroke, hoping that they don't leave any of their signs behind. But we've already made a match to Jack and the Zodiac on the P's. So I'm not worried about how this one looks different from here so far, because we know that in Jack's arsenal, it has like
One comment that I make about it is that I picked up on it last week in your last presentation. Nolan brought it up, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, pickup. I didn't even, blew right. I looked at that ransom note. I've had that thing open many times over the years, and it's surprising what you could miss. You know what I'm saying? I mean, for me anyway.
I'm still finding stuff.
But you know what I'm saying? I thought, oh, absolutely. Went back and yeah, that's absolutely a good point. And all the other things I could sit and talk about and tell you about things about that note for hours on end, and I wouldn't have had pickup, until last week. You know what I'm saying?
Well, we did cover. And actually, I'm going to make a disclosure really quick. I had this very interesting phone call from a gentleman who wanted to show me his solve to the ciphers. He called something the golden ratio. Have either of you heard of that?
No.
Something in mathematics land.
I'm not ready to retire yet.
It's something to do with mathematics, and it has something to do with these numbers he gave me a list of numbers, and he said add them up, divide them, you keep coming up with this 1.62 ratio. But whenever I applied it to the dates of the murders, I couldn't get it to come up to 1.62, and it frustrated him, so he got offensive and rude and started acting like I was too stupid to handle a calculator. Before I know it, I'm cussing at him, he's cussing at me, and he tells me, see you next Tuesday. I haven't been called to see you next Tuesday in a long time. Either way, I just wanted to make a disclosure to everybody out there. If you're going to request my time and energy to listen to your story about how your suspect is the Zodiac killer, do not be rude and offensive. Just send me the handwriting, the birth date of your suspect. If you have a solve to one of the ciphers, feel free to share your methodology with me, as concise as you can be. And if I can reproduce that what you found objectively, I will share your solve. But please do not get upset if I cannot recreate it, because it seems so fantastical. He literally thought that all of the dates of the murders amounted to a golden ratio, and he tried to discuss some mathematical equation, and then when he got rude, it was more or less he was comparing some Stanford mathematician to me, and I said, whoa, I do handwriting, not math, dude.
He's BS. There's tons of people out there that are going to BS you about the Zodiac stuff. Most of it's nonsense. You got the right guy. It's Jack Torrance. Nobody else fits the whole bill. And anybody tells you, oh, it's this guy or that, they're full of crap, because the guy is John W. Torrance Jr., a.k.a. Jack Torrance. That's the guy. The evidence is over freaking whelming.
I laughed because he kept saying Jack Torrance with an O is not the suspect, and I kept thinking inside my head, you're right, it's Jack Terrence, not Torrance.
I want to throw one real quick thing in about math, though. At some point, I'm going to show you the 7-11 stuff, which he definitely did, and his intentionally put 7 and 11 stuff, because of the paradise slaves, pair of dice, and all this sort of stuff. That hint, but we'll come to that later.
So 7-11 is a dice thing?
Fancy math applying to that stuff? No, Probably,
and I've heard the mathematical thing before. They talk about the last 18 on the unsolved portion of the hardened solve. And somebody wanted to say that worked out somehow to Michigan math thesis winner or something like that. So I've heard a lot of math being wrapped around it, but Jack was an engineer, and math, it revolves around his life.
Well, he'd use some math here and there, but to say that there's a formula for this, I mean, yeah, like you say, give him a chance to show you, but it's when he gets mad and you don't get it, well, that's a dead giveaway. That's you spin your wheels on a lot of people like that.
Yeah, when we were in text mode before we started talking, and he was extremely he was being offensive in that. Well, you're closed-minded and blah blah blah. I said, how am I closed-minded? And this is by text, mind you. I said, how am I closed-minded? I asked you to send me his handwriting, and I told you to call me before 5 p.m. and we'll discuss it. And if either of those don't work for you, I'm not the one that's closed-minded. You are.
Right. He's a narcissist. Right as soon as they start on your personality and want to control you, they're an overbearing narcissist.
Yeah. He kept telling me I'm wrong.
I've had.
He
a
kept
dose
telling
of
me
that.
I'm wrong, he's right. I'm like, that is not the way you get somebody to listen to you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
All right.
he gave a spin.
So back to this. Last week we introduced the debut letter, as Terry calls it, of the Zodiac speaking, which is the no address letter. And I remember you telling me all this time that you kept finding these Tim King clues inside of the communications. And so I thought this is probably a good time, because you had brought it up about that when we were talking, and how that relates to the Oakland County child killer case of Timothy King. And that more communications to come, we will be making the same references as they come about. But the FBI did state that the Zodiac killer predicted his crimes. I could never really understand that, because it kind of appeared to me that he was leaving clues about the past crimes in his communications, not so much. I mean, I do know that the one in New York, yes, that was a predictive code that he stated he was going to kill somebody in the future, but I hadn't really seen that before. So can you kind of explain that to us, where you're seeing? I have it up here on the screen. I have circled downward the word.
I can show you that. Point out the obvious. There's Tim on the left side vertically, and the capital K-I-N-G, and he used that capital K-I-N-G to a greater degree later on some of the documents we'll see later. But I actually came back to find this after I knew that he was placing great emphasis on capital K-I-N-G starting in 78 and the Ramsey murder note. And now, of course, we found recently, and I found this afterwards with that secret witness document from the OCCK case, where he put King on there twice with capital K-I-N-G. So he's, it's another one of these things where he does this redundantly to where okay, I get it, you're saying King. Let's go back. So I went back and did a review of the Zodiac killer documents, went to the debut of the Zodiac. It was up to that point, there was no Zodiac killer. The Zodiac thing came on right after Lake Berryessa and the knife attacks on Hartnell.
Well, this is before. The Zodiac speaking is before the Lake Berryessa.
No, well, unless they're telling me the wrong thing. I looked this morning, I looked up the subject, and they're saying this happened in August. Wasn't Lake Berryessa in September?
September. Yeah, so the debut of Zodiac speaking.
Oh, right, this came first. So they're just setting, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Just like that, this is my life. I was up at 4 a.m, so I'm a little punchy here. But so anyway, yeah, right away, as soon as I went back to look at this and some of the sister documents to these speaking documents, the first time I saw them, that caught my mind's eye. And trust me, my subconscious is several times smarter than I actually am. And it's like, okay, but it doesn't register. And they come back and I go, oh my God, he's got TIM right there on the left-hand side, plain as day, big and loud. And on the right-hand side, he's got King. So
do you think
really
he was
backwards?
Do you think he
chronologically that I discovered it?
Okay.
And he does it over and over and over. He does it repeatedly. He puts TIMM and TIWW that look like M's inverted, and he loves to invert things. There's a lot of things and devices he used.
Terry.
Go ahead.
I'm trying to.
I'm sorry.
I have to keep control here.
Yeah. So what do you want me to say about this? It's real obvious on the left, and it's on the right.
No. So you think that he was literally planning this as much as 7 years in advance?
Oh, absolutely. And then you get to the question why, which we can talk about later. But I asked the question why, and basically he's making statements all the time. He was constantly making statements. And in this case, I think the why had to do with his father. And his dad was an attorney and was stationed in Vietnam and was relocating people from the militarized zone to further south, rebuilding their encampments and stuff for them, and probably putting buttons on them to identify them, because of the language barrier. I don't know, just a guess on my part.
Oh, see, I thought you knew. I thought you knew that he was using buttons, and that's how you made a connection to the buttons letter. I did not know that it was a theory.
Why the fixation on buttons is, we'll see in Zodiac killer documents, this fixation on the word buttons. Buttons, misspell them intentionally, spell them correctly, things like that. So
well, that brings me.
Go ahead.
That brings me to my next point, is that you also commented that the Zodiac spelling errors were definitely intentional to place emphasis on the item as a signal, which is also along the lines of what Harriet believed. She believed that there was intentional pointing out or misspellings to draw your attention to that portion. Yeah. And then somewhere between those misspellings were the message that was really trying to be conveyed. And I'm hoping to have her on next week to do the actual solve that she has for the no address. That'll be interesting. But you also believe that.
Oh, yeah, they're signals. The intentionally misspelled words are signals. Now, what those signals actually, or what the actual message was trying to point to, takes some more study, and you have to kick it around, and then it'd be nice to find some proof, and there is some proof in different forms. But we get into a deeper subject when we go there with that. But the point is yeah, you can see that on, for example, the Ramsey murder note, some difficult words were spelled correctly, and others were intentionally misspelled, like business and possession were intentionally misspelled. And he definitely knows how to spell. When you can spell adequately properly, things like that, he proved that he could spell it. And plus, you could, it's like Bob Shields always said, how long do you think in advance he wrote this stuff? Oh. I said, I think he put a lot of time into planning everything he did.
Right.
Everything. So
and you also, you also mentioned that there was a switching of key codes can show a far different message. So what did you mean by switching key codes?
What I mean is if this is old gangster stuff going back. There are old black and white movies that touched on this, where these gangs would communicate with each other by applying a key code to a daily publication like a newspaper. And then if you have a different key code for each person you're dealing with or whatever, you can control the message they get and you get vice versa. And so in other words, you can take a page and write a key code and just take anything you want and write a key code, and your message is now if the person has that key code, they can write it to anything. You can take this first paragraph and make it and convolute it into a key code. So if you have a key to something, you have a way of communicating when nobody knows it unless you have the key codes. You know what I'm saying? Because they can pick up the newspaper. It says rain in Spain, blah, 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 and then you decode that. The boss man wants me to do this and that. It's old school. It goes way back. They touched about stuff, and that's where old black and white movies are great, because they talk about that stuff being around already, in the 20s and earlier. And
yes,
that kind of coded information is way older. It's centuries old, really.
But putting it in a movie makes
just saying it's easy to understand.
Putting it in a movie makes it seem so fantastical, so unimaginative. Like you couldn't imagine that these kind of things are going on. But I know that Nolan, you read a lot of books about the CIA and about that kind of stuff. And
this has to go mainly to the NSA. They're the ones that they're the code solvers.
Oh,
and they're actually the biggest security organization in the United States. They're bigger than CIA, bigger than the FBI, the National Security Association.
And where did they came out of? I think I talked about this before. They came out of the early on before. So like the FBI and the NSA were a spinoff of something else.
The CIA and the NSA came out of the OSS right after World War II. Yes.
Right.
The FBI was around for a long time, and Hoover was in charge of the FBI from the late 20s on.
I can't remember what I ate for breakfast, but I can remember stuff like that. My brain is just crammed with senseless stuff.
Yeah. The best book about codes and the NSA is called The Puzzle Palace.
Huh.
Oh, very good.
Is it a lengthy book? Is it easy to read?
It's tough to get through.
Gotcha.
It's just it's really technical, but it's a great book. It's often quoted.
Gotcha.
And it is probably not a perfect science, because as you can imagine, if you have gangsters using their own lingo to communicate, and they use it, they're already speaking in code, with this guy is this, represents something. Now you're trying to break that code. Well, you got to know their lingo. You got to know how they talk to each other, who they were referring to. They might have pet names and things like that. So it can be very difficult to crack that kind of a code. almost maybe impossible many times. But
that's what they say. The only person who can really crack the code is the person with the key. So,
right.
All right. Well, then that brings me to Terry's take on the Tate and LaBianca murders, which I thought, Nolan, this is probably your realm or your arena. Yeah, because I am not really up to date on any of this stuff. But some of the things he mentioned to me I thought was interesting was that Manson admitted to being a crime family operative to Geraldo. Yep. Both LaBianca and Folger, the coffee heiress, were big money, which, I never even really touched on that, Terry, when I listed those and I ran past them just because it was something happening during the time. What I failed to recognize is that we had Georgette Bauerdorf in this series, and she was a oil heiress. We had Tennyson in 1948, who was the son of a steel magnate. We have senators' daughters that are being killed. And all of these have in common is that they're all unsolved murders. I mean, well, with the exception of the Tate and LaBianca, they obviously hemmed up 4 people for it, but
who's behind it?
Who's behind it? The interesting
that's where you guys take over.
On the subject real quick is Tom O'Neill. Check him out on Joe Rogan's show talking about this stuff, and he revealed he was a deep dive into that whole subject of that, a lot more than I'm just kind of superficial to the Manson thing. You remember, like you say,
Chaos, a book called Chaos. I mentioned it last week, and it's about mainly the Tate LaBianca murders and the Manson clan, but it's also about the FBI, the CIA, and domestic programs. And there's one theory that Manson was actually an informant, and another theory that he was actually doing hits for other people. And it was some of the, not just these murders, but others as well. So, and it goes into COINTELPRO and MK Ultra. It's a really good book, really well-researched, really well-written. I think it came out in about 2011. Chaos is Tom O'Neill.
I'll bet,
So what did you mean by Bugliosi was a phony?
Well, the stuff he was writing about, and you can check this out with a guy like Tom
O'Neill. Yep.
O'Neill, and he's just saying, the more you look into Bugliosi, even his stuff on the JFK assassination, the more you realize that he's just a pontificating mess. He got more things wrong. He wrote an interesting book, sold lots of copies, but a lot of it's fiction. And I have friends that are voracious readers that have told me this. They're saying, as far as that term calling Polanski a super Jew, I picked that up in trade school from a guy that was a Jew. I didn't know a Jew from my elbow, when I was in trade school. And his name was, I forget now, but he described himself as a super Jew. I said, what's that? And he says, my people will put me in business several times and I can go bankrupt and they'll put me back into business. And he says, we have special protection and special privileges that you peons don't have, this sort of stuff. Now, whether it was blather or so I just use that term in describing Polanski because look at him. He got by with being a rapist that escaped and is hiding around Europe, but yet nobody picks him up and brings him back and holds him to trial. So he's got protection. Look at the protection Epstein had, and then the protection went away suddenly on him one day. And,
if we can get back to Bugliosi and the Tate LaBianca. So Bugliosi was the LA DA that prosecuted the Tate LaBianca cases. There was also another murder, Gary Hinman murder, committed by Bobby Beausoleil, who was one of the family, and Susan Atkins. But they chose not to include that in the Tate LaBianca because it didn't have the headlines. That's the type of guy Bugliosi was. But also, then he wrote the famous book, Helter Skelter, based on his theory of the motive in the Tate LaBianca murders, being that Charles Manson wanted to incite a race war between the blacks and the whites, and that's why they tried to make it look like the Black Panthers had committed a lot of these murders, and they would write things that they were trying to frame the Black Panthers.
So he was setting the narrative, kind of like Graysmith Witt did against Arthur Lee Allen in his Zodiac books.
And so what Tom O'Neill says is that theory of that motive for these murders is just all wrong. It's all Bugliosi. He did it to sell books, and it's not a valid theory of the motive.
Well, then that makes sense to me now because it hadn't before. And Terry, you had also said that Tate and Sebring were lovers.
Yeah, there's a picture on the internet going around, and you could probably have to go in the Wayback Machine to find it, but in the backyard of, I think, the key residence there's a picture of a pregnant Sharon Tate with Jay Sebring. That's a fake name. That wasn't his real name. He was from out east. But anyway, he's standing there wearing a Speedo, sporting a big heart on, and so that's something that Tom O'Neill also says that they were lovers. And I got to confirm that, but I can only point to that one picture if you can find it of them standing in the backyard, like, okay, here's my pregnant wife, and she's with her friend. He's wearing a Speedo.
Right.
He's sticking out.
Okay,
like
we don't
that.
have to. Yeah, we don't have to say that.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, come on, who does that? Who does that? With a guy's wife, if he's supposed to be Polanski's wife. I mean,
right.
Maybe in California, but
go ahead, Nolan.
Yeah, it's well documented that Sebring and Sharon Tate were boyfriend and girlfriend before she met Polanski.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
But he still was in love with her until the day they both died.
I'm glad you got Nolan here because I don't remember that sort of details.
Yeah, no, I've read like 4 books.
Right.
So basically, she's still hanging out with him, obviously, even while her husband is out of town.
Right.
Yeah, they're really good friends. Yeah, they were tight.
I bet.
And then if that Tom O'Neill reported.
Hold on.
They can go to motive.
What's that?
2 other points that can go to motive for the Tate murders anyway, and perhaps LaBianca. Both Sebring and Wojtek Frykowski, Folger's boyfriend, they were heavily involved in dope dealing. Frykowski with MDMA and Sebring with cocaine.
So right into the Chicago drug dealing, mafia kind of stuff.
Yeah. Frykowski had ties to Canada, and that's where the main suppliers of the MDMA were coming, and he was going to be the LA connection.
And you have to kind of be made to do that, right? You don't get to, back in those days, what people don't understand, and probably still today, you don't get to be a drug dealer in any particular area that is primarily ran by somebody who's a strong-arming person, right? I mean, you're either given way to do that or you're taken out of the way.
Yeah. And Sebring also was known as the hairdresser to the stars.
Right.
He was the most famous hairdresser in LA at that time.
Yep.
Well, then
his real name was something else. You remember what his real name was, Nolan? It's like
I know I could look it up, but yeah, J. Sebring, he named it after Sebring Raceway. It's a more sexy name. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not a fancy. His real name was not fancy, and he's buried in Michigan, state of Michigan or whatever. I think under his real name. I don't remember, but yeah, absolutely. He was a big deal, and so it's another act of domestic terrorism, with.
I was just going to say, you just took my words right out of my mouth. It does seem to run in tandem with other strong-arm attempts at very influential people that resulted in an unsolved murder of a loved one. So, yeah, although, like I said, they're back and forth. One day you get yes, Manson was the perpetrator of it, and the next day it is he's part of some larger group or organization. But I think that there's enough evidence with what I've read and what you guys are talking about to say that there is likelihood that Manson was part of something much larger. And what is the family? Everybody keeps saying the family.
Let us not forget the MK Ultra factor, which. That's come up for a long time, and also this Tom O'Neill brings that up, and I'm sure Nolan can tell you a little more about that. But there's
it started in San Francisco with there was a famous MK Ultra CIA doctor. I don't want to call him scientist. I guess
Gottlieb. Doctor. I think the doctor was Gottlieb, but I want to say
no. Gottlieb was in charge of back east, and this guy was affiliated with Gottlieb.
That's
Jolly
what I'm saying.
West was his name.
So as far as I can tell is that it originated in New York and was in Japan. And then in 1955, it came to San Francisco. So they had already opened operations in New York with the MK Ultra. And I think that's where Gottlieb, maybe Gottlieb was the one that was involved with the Canada. I'm not, there's so many locations, but I know that Canada, New York, Japan, and San Francisco were all hotspots. And we know that the Zodiac killer makes references to all of those locations.
Jolly West was a CIA affiliated psychologist, psychiatrist, mind control, MK Ultra hypnotist, and he had an office at the San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury free medical clinic, and Charles Manson's parole officer, Roger Smith, after he finished being a federal parole officer, also had an office there. And those two of the people that Manson saw quite often. And there's theories that both of them were involved in MK Ultra. And there's a reason why Manson would get in trouble and he never got his parole violated. And then he would get arrested several times and nothing would ever happen to him. They'd let him out all the time. So that's where Tom Neal says, how can this keep happening?
Right. Do you special protection once again.
Right. And do you think the family is any relation to what, you know, I've been talking about this Netflix thing called The Family, which is the high-powered and elite people who actually run the world, not just our country, but the world. Do you think there's a relation between those two families, the family?
I think it's coincidental. Family is just another name for what they call the Manson clan of the group, mainly women, but some men, and some people were in it for forever. Some people were in it for a month, a week, or whatever. But they just, the book that Ed Sanders wrote on the Manson clan is called The Family. So that's what they were known as. The Manson family.
These guys could very well be just a subset of the family. I mean, if they're doing the bidding of the high power elite, the ones that are running drugs and running guns and doing the things that the average public is not doing, they would be the family to me, right?
I think the people that were basically Manson's controllers, might have been linked up to what you're saying, that bigger picture of a bigger family.
Gotcha.
Because I'm not going to say controllers, but handlers.
Yes. There you go. All right. Well, that's going to actually take us into, if I can get myself over here, that's going to take us into Lake Berryessa. Come here. So on September 27th of 1969, Bryan Hartnell and Cecelia Shepard are at Lake Berryessa. This is the first time the Zodiac appears in a hood that has the Zodiac sign sewn onto it. And I liked Terry's take on this. Terry, you had something to say about the hood that we spoke about briefly yesterday.
Well, had these two perished at that attack, nobody'd know about the hood. And so it would have been a useless ploy. And the fact that Cecelia Shepard passed away, about 24 hours later, slipped into a coma and never came back, shows that she must have been very carefully and skillfully stabbed 20 times. It was 26 times, I believe, versus Hartnell is sitting up in bed, So she was able to corroborate what Bryan Hartnell was saying. So had they died, no good for the hood. So this whole Zodiac thing would have fallen to the wayside. So, yeah. And notice how Jack drew emphasis to the word knife over there on the car door. Look at how big that F is. And what I was going to say
about that's that upside down JT.
Right. Not only that, but on that, actually on the bleeding knife of the Zodiac one that I sent you, notice that knife is not covered with blood. Only a portion of that knife has blood on it. In other words, like the stabbing wound wasn't very deep. Because if you wanted to dispatch someone with a big knife, you hit a vital and they're immediately done for. I mean, they're not going to say another word. They're going to go into shock, and that's the end of their lives. And
he didn't do that.
That didn't happen. So this is a message, like you pointed out, Nanette. It's a message. It's like all this stuff is a message.
Well, so now let me give you guys this, because I just stumbled across this as I was preparing for this week, but this was what was actually going on. So in keeping with the underground syndicate, mafia, unions, the biggest of the big money, let's explore another avenue into what was happening at this time. These killings may have been a direct message or distraction in an ongoing labor dispute between first emergency responders and elected officials, warning them to back down. The killer made a call after each attack. The public is against cops and firemen the firemen are going on strike. And they did actually, within days of this particular murder, go on strike. So this put pressure on the taxpayers to foot the bill and end the strike as soon as possible. This resulted in more money, more new hires, and a new 911 call center, which was everything the employees and the unions were asking for.
Well, that's interesting. I'd never heard that before, but things like that do make sense. It's the killer's camp, or the monopolized media as they are these days, they're into sideshows all the time. And they have much more power than you or I talking about something and putting on a podcast. Because remember, when they say something on the tube, they're getting to millions of people at one time. So they can, so yeah, it's not surprising. But of course, back in those days, it might not have been such a monopolized media. There might have actually been more people that had different opinions about things, or different takes, or
what it kind of struck me as is this Golden State Killer revelation with the DNA, where now this whole entire press release on them finding the Golden State Killer really revolved around a bunch of officials pontificating about themselves and ultimately making a draw on the public for us to pressure for more funds for DNA testing and research. So that it kind of reminds me of the same thing. Whenever they want something, they can create some crisis or antagonist type situation, like you said, publicize it on the media, get it out there so that the public gets in enough roar and gets on board with assisting them in what they really want, which in that case was more money for DNA research.
They do it all the time. That's their best. They have it right there. Why wouldn't they, if they've got that kind of power? I mean, they'd say, "Oh, let's see what we can do is raise some funds for this, or that, or whatever."
Or to change laws.
Yes, to change laws.
Yeah. It's just like
absolutely.
Absolutely.
Like look at the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive. That was they and the sinking of the ship in the harbor. Right. The sinking of the Maine in Cuba. Throughout history, they stage these events in order to change policy or change the public way of looking at things, so they can get laws enacted, wars started, whatever that has to happen. So,
well, and I think that I heard that a lot. Every time we have a mass school shooting or something like that, the public goes into a fit of, oh, it's another one of these scenarios that's been created to take more of our gun rights away. They just don't want us to have guns, so they create these situations, and then they use that to take the guns away from the law-abiding citizens who are here to protect the public.
Right, it's a fear factor thing too. I believe that they want more than just you and I, we'd like to get a 2-for-1 deal. We like to get a deal or a 2-for-1 deal. I think that they rigged some of this stuff so they get way more than a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 deal when they do something. So they might have a whole scheming and a bunch of things that they feel that the advantages they're going to get. So yeah, hasn't it really escalated ever since the George Floyd thing? I mean, this country's gone crazy with all these murders going on, and now there's it's incredible that it's outrageous, but.
Well, it kind of makes sense to me. I mean, since we have this political notion that the killer's camp seems to be following, and these communications even call out, politicians being scared of him, which doesn't make any sense, because if he's just some low-life member of the public that's running around randomly killing people, why would any politician fear him? What would he have? Does he have pictures? Does he have information? What does he have on these people other than maybe these situations were exactly what he was hired to do, was to create this type of fear or what have you. I know that in Berkeley and San Francisco, they were rioting because of the Vietnam Wars. Here's another way to get people off the streets, freak them out through the newspapers and make them run and hide instead of being out protesting what the government was actually up to.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's one of Tom O'Neill's themes too, about the Manson murders, what they're called, Tate LaBianca, is basically it. After those murders, people, the general public, had a different way of looking at what they call hippies and so-called like student protesters, people with long hair, and people that were kind of progressive. The people were a lot more fearful of them.
Yeah,
and they call it basically the end of the '60s.
The fear factor. Everything's sold on a fear factor these days. Fear factor is a big thing, and look at what when you get on the so-called free television networks, whatever. It's always on fear or something if they're selling something. Afraid you need this, or you're afraid for that person. If they don't get it.
That's why I can't watch
the
TV
gun grabbing
anymore.
Thing. They played that gun grabbing game for decades, where it's okay. They tell the Democrats, okay, you play it like you're going to take their guns away, and we're going to play it like, no, you need.
We're on their side.
So we're playing.
All right. Well,
real quick, I just want to correct. Earlier, I said offensive. I misspoke. I was referring to the Gulf of Tonkin regarding the Vietnam War as an incident that was to provoke deeper involvement in the Vietnam War. It was a stage.
It was fake. Yeah, staged and faked. Right.
Yeah.
Wow. It just never ceases to amaze me. But let's get back to Cecelia and Bryan. So the Zodiac killer binds the couple with clothesline, stabs Cecelia Shepard 20 plus times. She passes out at the hospital, or she passes, sorry, at the hospital. So she was able to give her first statement. At this point in time, she's a student at UC Riverside per a FOIA file from the FBI on October 4th of 1969. He stabs Bryan Hartnell 6 to 7 times, but he survives as well. And both of these murders are on the murder map from Sandy Betts. So keeping in, I did map out and kind of give everybody an idea to see what it looked like, where the location was in Lake Berryessa. This is just 2 different versions looking 2 different ways at the same actual peninsula in which they were laying on the blanket at Lake Berryessa. And then somebody on the internet had placed a picture up here more in color showing you the tree that the Zodiac was hiding behind and where they were actually laid out next to the water. So the Zodiac killer also knew exactly where the location was in regards to park headquarters. We didn't have GPS back in those days, but he literally made a phone call saying 2 miles north or something like that. Like, he was very specific, as if he knew how to track location. And we know that Jack was really, really good at that. And also he would have to have had familiarity with the area. I think one of the things I read this week indicated that they believed that he was traveling on his way back to Vallejo, but that doesn't necessarily have to be his to-go point, because San Jose is also having some killings around this particular point in time. And we know that Jack has his brother and his mother and stepfather had lived in San Jose, but that his brother was still living in San Jose, and he was really on the go, because that no address letter was literally him stating he had no address. He was mobile in a makeshift home out of a bus, and he was driving that bus around wherever he was, but he also had his own vehicle at the same time. So basically, what's that?
What was that noise?
I don't know.
Okay, never mind.
Sounded like somebody's emails or something populating. Evidence from the crime scene. We also have the wing walker shoe imprint that shows up. It's not the first time that this has been found at a crime scene. This is actually, I believe, at least the second. The plastic clothesline that was used to bind the victims is up here in the right-hand corner and labeled for evidence. They indicate a 10 to a 10.5 wing walker military boot. Air Force was one of the militaries that received this particular boot. I had handwriting on the car door, but we haven't gotten to that yet. I moved that picture and not the words. But basically just giving you kind of an idea. I went and I tried to do some self-measurements here to see if I could come up with an actual size. And it was interesting to note that some people say a 10, some people say a 10.5. We know that Jack was a 10.5. And so it wasn't so much that I was doing this to just instill that Jack is the suspect, as much as I wanted to show the difference between a size 10 and a size 10.5. And I found that it was literally only 1/8 of an inch different in the actual foot size. But you have to take into consideration that just because somebody might be a size 10, they may have wider feet and have purchased that shoe in a 10.5 because they needed that a little bit of extra room around the front end of the foot. Yes.
You mean John Walker Tarrance Jr. wore wing Walker military?
I bet he would. Yeah, he reveled in that.
Name Walker. Nolan know more about this than me, but that name Walker comes up as kind of insidious in the Bush family tree. But we'll go into that later if you want.
Yeah. Let's stick to this one.
Walker.
Well, so basically, what I did is I took their own measuring. So what's that?
It's a W. W.
W.
Yeah. That's it for Walker.
Well, I believe that the Zodiac in his end letters called out the bushes, so it makes sense. It's right there.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, I took the measuring tape that they used on the shoe for the width, and I obviously then just turned that bad boy sideways and ran it up and down the length of the sole of the shoe, and I found that it was just under 12.5 inches. So right at about 12.375 is literally what the measuring tape came up to. You can see where the lines up to the edge of the heel, down to the tip of the toe. And when I worked out the simple math on that, obviously I just took some random boots and I measured the random boots of a size 9 shoe. And that size 9 shoe yielded a 12-inch sole. So basically an extra 1.5 inches for 3/4 maybe on the back, 3/4 on the front end of extra length on that particular shoe, because the size of the foot is on the inside, not on the outside of the overall shoe. So taking that information, I removed the 1.5 inches, or I added, should I say, 1.5 inches, both to a size 10 and both to a size 10.5. And lo and behold, the 10.5, adding that 1.5 inch, came up to 12.375, which is exactly what is marked on that measuring tape right there. So I'm going with, this is more likely a 10.5 size shoe based on the sole length itself.
I have a question for you. Was he known to wear wing walkers all the time, or he just put them on when he went to do his crimes?
I don't know. Well, he says that he doesn't ever look normally like he does when he commits his crimes. Okay. And in DB Cooper, he talks about using makeup, a toupee, like he's literally CIA adept in changing his appearance and looking like somebody completely different. So I would tend to think that he reserved those boots from his military time and was literally only using them during crimes.
I'm thinking so.
Also, to be fair, what's his name? Arthur Lee Allen was known to wear wing walkers as well.
Well, and that's probably one of the reasons, but he also flew. I was under the impression that he was also a pilot, so it would make sense that he had them.
And they both, I believe, had access to the PX or BX, whatever they call it, the store of the military.
Probably really well-built boots, too. They're probably good stuff.
And I think Dennis made reference to Lee Allen in regard to the Berryessa murders.
Yes. And as a matter of fact, when Arthur Lee Allen came up as a suspect on the news for the Lake Berryessa attacks, Jack saw Arthur Lee Allen's face on the TV, and he mentioned out loud that that nice guy gave me a ride home from the lake. So he literally even put Arthur Lee Allen in the vicinity. But there was also this talk, because you got to remember we're about 2 years from DB Cooper. There was also this talk that Jack was taking flying lessons from a friend. So I started to heavily wonder if the fact that he had given him that ride home from Lake Berryessa, he was also a pilot, had access to a plane. Jack is taking flying lessons. Jack is then jumping out of a plane in the middle of a $200,000 heist. And then he makes Arthur Lee Allen, the very person who's helping him, the patsy for the entire thing. Well, I'm going to have to end it on that. I know, right? It all just wraps itself around in one neat little ball. We're going to end it here with the shoe sizes. I got just less than a minute. If there's anything else either of you would like to add.
Well, it's obvious that the aerial views are, from my experience of studying this stuff, that, this guy had aerial views of a lot of stuff. which we haven't got time to explain right now. But you were saying, how would you know this is here and it's this shape? But the aerial views start telling you something about the crime locations that, whether it be round in the snow for Donald Lass, was it, or
Right.
for Tahoe? I mean, yeah, and then you'll see, it'll come in with the Ramsey murder too.
See, he had access. He could spot things out of the sky at 30, 40,000
he was flying around.
pictures. Yeah. How about you, Nolan? Anything else to add?
I'm good.
Awesome, you guys. Well, thank you so much. This was a blast. We will be back next week to finish off the Lake Berryessa murders. Everybody have a wonderful weekend, and thank you guys for being here.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
No, no, no.